This video is a quick crash course about finding information to answer your clinical question. So to do this, we're going to walk through a scenario. The scenario is that I've decided to develop my practice or start a program to help people with type 2 diabetes. To do this, I need a lot of information, including assessment guidelines, exercise and nutrition guidelines, maybe lifestyle modification guidelines, and then measurement tools and tests for all of these, or at least those which are deemed most meaningful. So for example, maybe I think it's really meaningful to have a measurement tool or test to help me do assessment or to help me take a really thorough history of my patient or client. Maybe I want a measurement test that I can use to evaluate exercise when I'm working with them more actively, or to use those evaluations to see progress over time. So these are different options that I have. Now, how do I find relevant research evidence? I'm going to use this evidence hierarchy or evidence pyramid, which I discussed in more detail in the evidence-based practice video. And if you haven't watched that video, I really recommend you watch it before you watch this one. So what we're going to look for are summaries and synopses, so clinical practice guidelines, clinical measurement tools and tests, as well as those synopses which summarize research evidence further down the pyramid. In this video, I'm not going to look at patient decision aids because there isn't a particularly difficult decision for patients or clients to make in this scenario, but it might be really relevant to you in your clinical work. So where do I find relevant research evidence? Well, I've listed a bunch of databases here for clinical practice guidelines and measurement tools and tests. These aren't definitive lists, but these will help you on your way to searching for evidence by yourself, because these are quite relevant databases to us as kinesiologists. Now, I'm going to work through some of these databases, but actually what we're going to start with is Google. So what I want to stress about using Google is that it can be very valuable. However, we don't search Google for the answer directly. Instead, what I really recommend using Google for is searching Google for a reputable source, like a source that you know or highly suspect is going to be very trustworthy. So for example, for diabetes, I typed in Diabetes Canada, a really well-known and respected association. And then I typed in guidelines because that's the keyword, the information that I'm looking for from them. And right away, top of the list, I have full guidelines from Diabetes Canada. So clicking on that, I can see that they have 2018 guidelines listed here in all kinds of different, subsections of diabetes. You can see very quickly there's stuff very useful to us for our scenario. So physical activities and diabetes guidelines, for example. Peppered throughout, there's a whole bunch more in this list. And also at the bottom of the list, we can see guidelines for different age groups and different populations. So in about 10 seconds, we found full guidelines that are highly relevant to us and likely, very well done because we can really trust this association. But of course, you can also look, for example, at the methods that they use to develop these guidelines. Now, if we don't know of a reputable organization or association, this is when we go to the database list. So I'm just going to start with Dynamed. So I type Dynamed into Google, I get to this homepage, and I'm going to use diabetes exercise guidelines as my keyword search here. So searching for that, the first thing that comes up looks pretty useful. So physical activity for type 2 diabetes. I follow that and I can see I get a pretty decent overview, mostly based on the American Diabetes Association and other American associations. However, if I search for Canada in here, I can see the Canadian guidelines show up here. So it links us to the Canadian guidelines. However, these Canadian guidelines linked here are 2008 as opposed to 2018. So what I wanted to highlight here is even if you use this database route and you find guidelines, if there is an association name attached to them, I really recommend searching up the association in Google to make sure those guidelines are as up to date as possible. Usually guidelines are updated no more than 5 years later, so 5-year cycles. So this 2008 guideline is a big red flag. All right, so let's try searching for similar information in a different database. So this database is PEN, which is more nutrition focused typically, but it actually also has quite a bit of exercise information. So here I'm going to look for exercise in it. So diabetes, exercise are my keywords. And you can see what comes up here actually aren't guidelines anymore. There are these kind of practice question, this is what they've termed practice questions, which are essentially synopses of research evidence with a clinical bent or clinical audience in mind. So I'm just going to click on the first one to see what we get. And here I am stuck with a paywall. So I wanted to show you this because you can't expect that every database will necessarily be accessible to you. This one is not accessible to me, but there are ways around this. You can access databases through oftentimes your public library. Sometimes you have alumni access through your educational institutions. There's also the option of looking in databases with similar synopses in this case. So I know that clinical answers or clinical questions, this type of information can also be searched up in Cochrane Library. So if I want this kind of information, I'm going to go to Cochrane Library and see if I can find something similar. So in Cochrane Library, I'm typing in diabetes physical activity. The reason I'm not using exercise here is simply because when I played around with it, physical activity gives better results. And sometimes you do have to use these synonyms. So across the top here, you can see a whole bunch of different types of results. And what we're going to click on is clinical answers. So in clinical answers, we actually only get one result. So this result here. So I'm going to click on that because it does look highly relevant to us. And when I click on that result, I get my clinical answer. So it's in a more clinical language as opposed to research language. And what this is doing is just summarizing the systematic review that is giving this information. So now that I've got a bunch of information about guidelines and information about synopses, I want to go find some measurement tools and tests. So what I'm going to do is type in diabetes and exercise into this Cosmin database. And this Cosmin database is really useful because it really summarizes clinical measurement tools. So here when I type in diabetes exercise, I can see I get two results, and this top result actually looks quite useful. So it has outcome measurement tools or tests for diabetes. Great. When I click on this, you can see that I get an abstract. I get the DOI link to the full article, and oftentimes these articles, which are all systematic reviews, are open access, and this one is. But I want to stay on this database page because if I scroll down, you can see that there's a list of every single instrument they included in this review, and I think there's something like 250 in this review. So if I scroll through this list, I can very quickly find, just based on the name, this barriers to exercise checklist. This sounds like it might be a very useful assessment tool. There's a whole bunch of other ones through here, but basically if you see something within the systematic review in this database that looks useful to you, then you can go directly to the article itself and find out more about that measurement tool or test. So this is how you use the Cosmin database, as well as all the other databases that I use as examples in this video. I hope this gave you a quick taste of how to approach finding relevant research evidence.